Picture this. A man crawls across marble. His fingers leave red smears on white stone, long, desperate streaks like a child's painting made in panic. The toga that once marked him as the most powerful man in the known world is now a soaked rag, heavy with the copper-stinking weight of what's pouring out of him. He tries to rise. His arms buckle. He tries again. Something wet and essential slides between his ribs where steel has already been. The sounds are wrong. That's what witnesses would remember. Not screaming. He isn't screaming. Just the thick, gurgling effort of a man trying to breathe through a chest filling with blood. The slap of sandals on stone as figures circle him. The whisper of iron being pulled free of muscle. And underneath it all, the obscene intimacy of the noise. The sound of a body being opened, again and again, while its owner is still inside. 23 wounds. They'll count them later, the physicians who examine what's left. 23 separate entries, though only one will prove fatal. The rest are panic, frenzy. The work of men who have never killed before and don't know when to stop. He pulls his toga over his face. Not to hide, there's no hiding now. Perhaps to preserve some dignity. Perhaps because he cannot bear to see them anymore. These men he trusted. These senators he promoted and pardoned and enriched. Perhaps because he finally understands what the soothsayer meant about the Ides of March. The marble beneath him is expensive, imported from Greece, chosen specifically for this theatre that his greatest enemy built, a theatre where his own statue stands watching from the corner. Pompey's stone eyes witness what Pompey's living ones never could. Caesar, dying at his feet. The senators stand in a loose circle, breathing hard. Blood on their hands, on their togas, on their faces. 60 of them entered this conspiracy, though only a fraction struck blows. Now they look at each other and see something unexpected in their colleagues' eyes. Not triumph, not relief, fear. The body has stopped moving. The chest no longer rises. The greatest general Rome has ever produced, the man who conquered Gaul, who crossed the Rubicon, who made kings kneel and nations beg, lies face down in another man's theatre, blood spreading beneath him like a slow red tide. Marcus Junius Brutus steps forward. His hands are shaking. The dagger in his grip is slick. Caesar's blood runs down the blade and drips from the pommel onto his wrist, warm against his skin. He looks at what they've done. We are liberators, he tells himself. We have saved the Republic. But the Republic doesn't feel saved. The Republic feels like this room, silent, splattered, and reeking of something that will never wash clean. Historians still debate whether Caesar saw Brutus among his killers, whether that famous last line, "You too, child," was ever actually spoken. What the sources agree on is simpler and worse. Caesar stopped fighting when he saw Brutus raise his blade. He stopped fighting because there was no one left to trust, nothing left to fight for. The senators lift their daggers to the sky. They shout to the empty chamber that tyranny is dead, that Rome is free, that their names will live forever alongside the great tyrannicides of history. 60 conspirators, 60 men who convinced themselves they were heroes. Here is what they did not know, could not know, as they stood over the corpse of Gaius Julius Caesar on that March morning. Every single one of them would die for this. Not quickly, not cleanly, not as martyrs to liberty. They would die hunted, betrayed, forgotten. They would die in battle and in exile by their own swords and by their enemies' hands. They would die begging for mercy that wouldn't come, running from armies that wouldn't stop, watching their families stripped of wealth and name and future. Rome would have its revenge. Not because Rome loved Caesar, though it did, more than these senators ever understood, but because power, once seized, cannot be surrendered. Because blood demands blood. Because the men who thought they were ending a dictatorship were actually beginning a civil war that would burn the Republic to ash. The question that echoes across 2,000 years is not whether they were right to kill him. The question is simpler and infinitely more terrible. Was any death, any of the deaths that followed, worth what they purchased on that marble floor? The blood was still wet when they marched out into the sunlight. Brutus led them. Of course Brutus led them. He was the face of the conspiracy, the philosophical heart, the man whose ancestor had driven out the last king of Rome 5 centuries ago. The name meant something. The name meant everything. When Romans thought of tyrannicide, they thought of Brutus. and now a Brutus had done it again. They raised their daggers as they walked. They shouted to the Forum that liberty had been restored, that the tyrant was dead, that the Republic had been rescued from the jaws of the monarchy. They expected cheering. They expected citizens rushing forward to embrace them, to carry them on shoulders through the streets, to weep with gratitude. The Forum was silent, not empty. Romans had gathered, drawn by the commotion, by the rumours that something terrible had happened at Pompey's theatre. But they didn't cheer, they stared. Some covered their mouths. A few backed away, slowly, the way you retreat from a dog that might be rabid. The assassins stopped walking. Cassius, the lean, hungry one, the true architect of the plot, scanned the crowd with growing unease. These were supposed to be their people. Caesar had been a dictator, a king in all but name, a man who had trampled the Senate's authority and made a mockery of Republican tradition. Why weren't they celebrating? "Citizens of Rome," Brutus called out, his voice carrying across the stones. "The tyrant is dead. The Republic is restored. Your liberty is returned to you." A child started crying somewhere in the crowd. Her mother picked her up and hurried away without looking back. The senators exchanged glances. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. In their planning sessions, all those whispered meetings in private homes, all those oaths sworn by lamplight, they had imagined this moment as transcendent. They had imagined Rome rising as one to thank them. What they hadn't imagined was the truth. Most Romans didn't want the Republic restored. The Republic meant civil wars. The Republic meant grain shortages and debt crises and senators enriching themselves while the poor starved. The Republic meant chaos. Caesar had meant order. Caesar had meant land for veterans, bread for the hungry, games and spectacles and the illusion, or perhaps reality, that someone powerful actually cared about ordinary people. The senators had killed a tyrant. Rome had lost its father. Historians still debate whether the conspirators genuinely misread public sentiment or simply didn't care about it. What the sources agree on is that the next hours were marked by confusion, paralysis, and mounting dread. The liberators retreated to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, barricading themselves inside while they figured out what to do next. They had planned the assassination down to the smallest detail. They had not planned what came after. Meanwhile, Caesar's body lay where it had fallen. For hours, no one moved it. The blood cooled and darkened. Flies began to gather. The most powerful man in the Mediterranean world rotted in an empty theatre while his killers huddled on a hill, and his supporters scrambled to understand what had happened. Mark Antony was one of the first to learn. Caesar's co-consul, his loyal lieutenant, his friend. Antony had been deliberately lured away from the theatre that morning, drawn into a lengthy conversation in an adjoining room while the knives came out. When he heard the news, he ran. Not to the Capitoline, not to confront the assassins. He ran to Caesar's house. Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, let him in. She was in shock, barely speaking, her eyes swollen from crying. But she still had the presence of mind to hand over what Antony had come for. Caesar's papers, Caesar's treasury, and, most importantly, Caesar's will. The will would change everything. But Antony didn't open it yet. First, he needed to survive the night. First, he needed to understand who still controlled what legions, which senators had remained loyal, and whether the assassins planned to come for him next. They didn't. That was their second catastrophic mistake. The first mistake was killing Caesar and assuming Rome would thank them. The second was leaving Antony alive and assuming he would accept it. On the Capitoline, the liberators sent messengers down the hill testing the political winds. Cicero, the great orator who had not participated in the killing but celebrated it, urged an immediate meeting of the Senate to legitimize the assassination. Brutus wanted amnesty for all conspirators, guaranteed by law. Cassius, darker and more realistic, argued they should have killed Antony too, and perhaps still could. Brutus refused. Antony was not a tyrant. Antony was merely a man, and Brutus would not become the thing he had just destroyed. Noble, principled, fatal. The sun set on the Ides of March. Rome held its breath. The liberators told themselves they had won. And somewhere in the city, Mark Antony unrolled Caesar's will and began to smile. He had just found his weapon. The funeral pyre was built in the Forum. They carried Caesar's body through streets lined with silent crowds. Not silent from indifference, but from something rawer. Grief that hadn't yet found its voice. Rage that hadn't yet found its target. The corpse was displayed on an ivory couch, draped in the blood-stained toga he had died in, each of the 23 wounds visible to anyone who pushed close enough to look. And they did push, thousands of them, climbing over each other for a glimpse of what remained of their champion. Mark Antony had negotiated brilliantly in the days following the assassination. He had agreed to an amnesty for the conspirators, no prosecutions, no reprisals, their positions and properties protected. In exchange, the Senate had validated all of Caesar's appointments and laws, ensuring Antony's own power remained intact. Brutus and Cassius thought they had won a reasonable peace. They had actually handed Antony the knife he would use to cut their throats. The funeral was Antony's stage. As consul, he had the right to deliver the eulogy. As Caesar's friend, he had the moral authority. As a born performer with a voice that could shake marble, he had the skills. And as the man who had read Caesar's will in private, he had information the crowd was desperate to hear. He began quietly, almost humbly. He praised Caesar's conquests, his victories, his service to Rome. He listed the nations subdued, the enemies defeated, the glory won. The crowd murmured and nodded. This was proper, this was expected. Then Antony pulled out the toga. He held it up, the actual garment still stiff with dried blood, each knife hole visible against the white wool. He pointed to them, one by one. Here is where Casca struck first. Here is where Simba pulled him close. Here is where Brutus, noble, honourable Brutus, drove his blade home. The murmuring turned to moaning, and then Antony read the will. Caesar had left his private gardens to the people of Rome. Every Roman citizen would receive 300 sesterces from his personal fortune. The man the senators had called a tyrant had remembered the common people in his death. The men who called themselves liberators had taken this gift-giver, this provider, this father, and butchered him on cold marble. The moaning turned to screaming. Historians still debate whether Antony planned what happened next or simply failed to prevent it. What the sources agree on is that the crowd transformed. They seized the ivory couch and built the pyre right there in the forum, feeding it with benches and market stalls and anything that would burn. They threw perfume and jewellery into the flames. Musicians snapped their instruments and added the wood. Veterans hurled the decorations from their own triumphs. The fire climbed higher. Sparks rose toward the darkening sky. And then the mob turned toward the Capitoline, torches in hand, screaming for the blood of the assassins. They found Helvius Cinna first. He was a poet, not a conspirator, but he shared a name with Cornelius Cinna, one of the plotters. The mob didn't care about the distinction. They didn't ask questions. They tore him apart with their hands, ripping limbs from sockets, parading his head on a pike through streets that stank of smoke and copper. The wrong Cinna, killed for a name. On the Capitoline, the liberators heard the screaming. They smelled the smoke. They saw the glow of fire against the evening clouds and understood, finally, the scale of their miscalculation. They had killed Caesar to save the Republic from monarchy. They had created a void that was filling with chaos. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome that night. Not openly. They slipped out through side gates, horses waiting, trusted slaves carrying what gold could be quickly gathered. Behind them, the forum burned. Behind them, Antony consolidated power. Behind them, everything they had built was already beginning to collapse. The Senate had granted them provinces. Brutus would take Macedonia. Cassius would claim Syria. They told themselves this was strategy. They would raise armies in the east, return in strength, restore proper order. They told themselves Rome would come to its senses once the grief passed. But provinces meant exile, armies meant civil war, and every mile they travelled from Rome was another mile deeper into the wilderness from which they would never return. Antony watched them go. He had won the first round without drawing a sword. But Antony was not the only player in this game. Somewhere in the provinces, a 19-year-old boy had just received news of his great-uncle's death. His name was Gaius Octavius. Caesar's will had adopted him as son and heir. He was already on his way to Rome. The assassins had killed one Caesar. They had accidentally created another. The ships left at night. Brutus sailed from Antium, watching the Italian coastline fade into darkness until even the lighthouse fires were swallowed by the sea. The water was black beneath him, stretching eastward toward Macedonia like a road paved in the ink. He had walked this road before, as a young man accompanying Pompey, as a pardoned rebel accepting Caesar's mercy. Now he walked it as a murderer fleeing the city that should have worshipped him. The salt air tasted like endings. Cassius had already gone, slipping out of Italy weeks earlier, his departure quieter but no less desperate. Syria awaited him, Rome's richest eastern province, a land of legions and gold and strategic depth. If the assassins were going to survive, they needed soldiers. If they were going to restore the Republic, they needed war. Neither man wanted to admit what they were actually doing, preparing to invade their own country. The other conspirators scattered like seeds in a windstorm. Some fled to provinces they had been granted, hoping distance would equal safety. Some stayed in Italy, trusting the amnesty, trusting the law, trusting that Roman institutions would protect Roman senators. Some simply vanished, into estates, into exile, into the waiting silence of men who had gambled everything and lost. Decimus Brutus went north, to Cisalpine Gaul. His situation was unique among the conspirators, and uniquely tortured. He had been closer to Caesar than any of them, not just a senator but a trusted general, a friend, perhaps the nearest thing Caesar had to a confidant in his final years. Caesar had named him in his will. Caesar had granted him provinces and honours. Caesar had loved him, and Decimus had helped kill him. The journey north gave him time to think. Too much time. The roads were good, Roman engineering carrying him smoothly toward his province. But the nights were long, and the wine didn't help as much as it should have. In dreams he saw Caesar's face, not the death mask, not the bloody ruin on the marble floor, but the living face, laughing across a dinner table, conferring over maps in campaign tents, embracing him after the victory in Gaul. Et tu, Decime. The words Caesar probably never said, rearranged in nightmare Latin. Historians still debate whether Decimus ever regretted his role in the assassination, or whether he died believing himself righteous. What the sources agree on is that his situation deteriorated rapidly. Antony declared Cisalpine Gaul his own, and marched north to claim it. Decimus found himself besieged in Mutina, his legions outnumbered, his supplies dwindling, his carefully planned provincial command transformed into a trap. Meanwhile, in Rome, the boy had arrived. Octavian was everything the conspirators had failed to anticipate. Young, yes. Sickly, yes. Untested in war and unknown in politics. But he carried a name now. Caesar's name, legally adopted, publicly proclaimed, and that name was worth more than legions. Veterans flocked to him. Senators who wanted stability saw opportunity. Even Cicero, the old Republican who had dreamed of using the boy as a weapon against Antony, found himself outmaneuvered. Octavian was no one's tool. Octavian was no one's puppet. Octavian was patient, and patience, in the chaos following Caesar's death, was the deadliest weapon of all. The triumvirate formed in November of 43 BC, Antony, Octavian and Lepidus, three men who hated each other but hated the assassins more. They divided the Roman world between them like butchers portioning a carcass. They drew up lists of enemies to be eliminated, and at the top of those lists, written in the same blood-red ink that would soon flow through Roman streets, were the names of every man who had raised a blade on the Ides of March. The proscriptions began immediately. It was legal murder, sanctioned by emergency powers that the triumvirs had granted themselves. Names were posted in the forum, property was confiscated, bounties were offered for heads, literal heads, to be delivered for payment. Slaves were encouraged to betray masters, sons were rewarded for turning in fathers. The streets of Rome ran with blood that made Caesar's assassination look like a paper cut. Cicero died in those proscriptions. The greatest orator Rome had ever produced, hunted down on a country road, his head and hands sent back to Rome and nailed to the speaker's platform where he had once defended the Republic with nothing but words. But Cicero was not an assassin. He was merely adjacent to them, guilty by sympathy. The actual killers, the men whose blades had opened Caesar's body, were still out there, still gathering armies, still hoping the Republic they had murdered for might somehow be resurrected. The hunters were coming, and the hunters had been given permission to use any means necessary. The first assassin to die did not die well. Gaius Trebonius had drawn perhaps the most critical assignment on the Ides of March: keep Mark Antony occupied while the others did the killing. He had succeeded brilliantly. engaging Antony in conversation outside the theatre, delaying him with manufactured concerns about legislation, preventing the one man who might have saved Caesar from entering the room in time. Now, 2 years later, Trebonius was governor of Asia Minor. The province was wealthy, distant from Rome, theoretically safe. He had rebuilt his life among the marble colonnades and incense-thick temples of the Eastern Mediterranean. He had convinced himself the worst was over. He was wrong. Publius Cornelius Dolabella arrived in early 43 BC. Technically, Dolabella was passing through on his way to Syria, where he planned to challenge Cassius for control of that richer province. Practically, Dolabella was a man who had switched sides so many times that his loyalties had become meaningless. What mattered was opportunity, and Trebonius represented an opportunity too perfect to ignore. A conspirator, isolated, wealthy, and officially condemned by the triumvirate's proscription lists. The siege of Smyrna was brief. Trebonius had a garrison, but Dolabella had an army, and the mathematics of ancient warfare favoured mass over walls. When the city fell, Trebonius tried to flee. His own soldiers caught him and handed him over, preferring Dolabella's gold to their governor's gratitude. What followed took 2 days. Dolabella didn't simply execute Trebonius. Execution was too clean, too quick, too merciful for a man who had helped murder Caesar. Instead, he handed the prisoner to his soldiers with a single instruction: make it last. The accounts differ on the specifics. Some sources say Trebonius was flogged until his back was a sheet of red meat, then revived with vinegar and flogged again. Others describe more creative torments: hot irons, implements, the slow systematic destruction of a body that was kept conscious through every innovation of agony. What the sources agree on is the sound. Witnesses described screaming that lasted through the night, screaming that could be heard across the city, screaming that eventually degraded into something less than human, a raw, hoarse, animal noise that continued long after words had become impossible. When dawn finally came, Dolabella had Trebonius beheaded. The body was left unburied, tossed into the street for dogs. The head was kicked around the city like a ball before being mounted on a pike and sent toward Rome as a gift. First blood, first message. This is what happens to Caesar's killers. This is what waits for all of them. Historians still debate whether Dolabella's cruelty was strategic theatre or personal sadism, whether he destroyed Trebonius to send a message to the other conspirators, or simply because he enjoyed it. What the sources agree on is the effect. The remaining assassins understood suddenly and viscerally that surrender was no longer an option. The proscription list had stripped them of legal protection. Trebonius's death had stripped them of any hope for mercy. They would fight, or they would die screaming. There was no third choice. Cassius moved first. He had been building his army in Syria, recruiting legions, securing gold, preparing for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. When news of Trebonius reached him, he marched immediately against Dolabella, driven by something that might have been vengeance and might have been calculation. Dolabella never reached Syria. Cassius intercepted him at Laodicea, besieged him, and watched as Dolabella's own soldiers turned against their commander. When the city fell, Dolabella didn't wait for Cassius's creativity. He ordered a servant to cut his throat. A cleaner death than Trebonius had received, a death with some dignity left, but Dolabella's end changed nothing. The killing machine had been activated, and it would not stop for individual victories or defeats. The triumvirate was still in Rome, the legions were still marching east, and Brutus and Cassius, now united in Macedonia with an army of nearly 100,000 men, were running out of time and running out of places to run. They chose to stand at Philippi, not because it was good ground. The terrain was mediocre at best, hemmed by mountains and sea in ways that limited manoeuvre. Not because they had superior forces. The triumvirs were bringing comparable numbers, and the quality of the opposing legions was at least equal. They chose Philippi because they had no choice. The Republic, or what remained of it, or what they pretended remained of it, would make its last stand in the dust and blood of northern Greece. The battle would begin within weeks, and before it ended, 2 more assassins would be dead by their own hands. While Cassius hunted Dolabella in the east, Decimus Brutus was dying slowly in the forests of Gaul. His situation had collapsed with staggering speed. The siege at Mutina had seemed like salvation at first. The Senate, still nominally functioning, had sent armies to relieve him, eager to use Decimus as a counterweight against Antony's ambitions. The consuls Hirtius and Pansa had marched north with legions. Octavian, the boy wonder, had brought his own forces. For a brief shining moment, Decimus had believed the Republic was actually coming to save one of its own. The relief worked. Antony was defeated at Mutina, his army shattered, his reputation seemingly ruined. Decimus emerged from the siege to something that looked like triumph. Then Hirtius died in battle. Pansa died of wounds shortly after. And Octavian, the young man everyone had underestimated, calmly took command of both their armies, added them to his own, and marched back to Rome to seize the consulship by force. He was 20 years old. He had just outmaneuvered the entire Roman Senate, and Decimus, the man the Senate had supposedly sent those armies to save, was suddenly alone in northern Italy with a handful of legions, no allies and enemies everywhere. He tried to march east to join Brutus and Cassius in Macedonia. It was the obvious move, the only logical move, the move that might have changed everything had it succeeded. An experienced general with additional legions joining the main conspirator army before the decisive battle. History might have broken differently, but the Alps were in the way, and between Decimus and the Alps lay 100 miles of hostile territory, controlled by men who had every reason to want him dead. His legions began to desert. It happened gradually at first, individual soldiers slipping away in the night, then squads, then entire centuries. They weren't cowards, they were pragmatists. Decimus had no money to pay them. The Senate's promises had proven worthless. Octavian was offering land and gold to any soldier who joined his side. Why die for a murderer when you could prosper under a Caesar? By the time Decimus reached the foothills of the Alps, he had perhaps a few hundred men left. Loyal veterans mostly. Men who had served under him in Gaul, who remembered his competence, who believed in his ability to find a way through. Even now, reduced and desperate, he projected confidence. Historians still debate whether Decimus genuinely believed he could escape, or whether he was simply too proud to surrender. What the sources agree on is that he reached out to a Gallic chieftain named Camillus, seeking safe passage through tribal territory to the Alpine passes beyond. Camillus agreed. Camillus offered hospitality, supplies, guides through the mountain paths. Camillus was lying. The chieftain had already sent messengers to Antony. The bounty on Decimus's head was substantial. Gold, favour, the gratitude of the man who would soon rule Rome. Camillus had weighed loyalty to a desperate fugitive against profit from a rising power. Profit won. The ambush came in a forest clearing. Decimus was seized before he could draw his sword, his remaining guards cut down in moments. They bound his hands with rope, the same hands that had once clasped Caesar's in friendship. They stripped his armour, the same armour he had worn in triumph through Gallic villages. They marched him through the trees like a slave. The execution was quiet. No crowd to witness it. No famous last words recorded for history. A soldier stepped behind him, drew a blade across his throat, and that was the end of Decimus Brutus. They took his head. Of course they took his head. That was the proof Antony needed, the trophy the triumvirate demanded. It was packed in salt and sent south, a gift wrapped in cloth and horror. The man who had been closer to Caesar than any other assassin died in a Gallic forest, killed by barbarians for bounty money, his body left for wolves. Et tu, Decime? Perhaps Caesar asked it. Perhaps he didn't. But the universe had answered regardless. The betrayer had been betrayed. The man who had deceived his friend had been deceived by a stranger. The senator who thought he was saving the Republic had become meat for wild dogs in a forest that Rome had never bothered to name. Justice, the triumvirs would call it. But there was no justice in any of this. Only power, and the uses to which power could be put, and the men who would be ground up in its machinery. Decimus was the 6th assassin to die. Dozens more remained, and the largest battle since Pharsalus was now only weeks away. The plain stretched between the mountains and the sea, a flat expanse of dust that would soon become mud, and then blood, and then a graveyard. Brutus and Cassius had positioned their army well, or as well as geography permitted. Their camp sat on high ground to the south, with the Via Egnesia running through the battlefield like a spine. The road to the east, to Asia, to escape remained open behind them. If things went badly, they could retreat and fight another day. The triumvirs had marched from the west with roughly equal numbers, Antony commanding one wing, Octavian the other. Octavian was sick, barely able to stand, his body racked by whatever chronic illness plagued him throughout his life. His soldiers had carried him to the field in a litter. His presence was symbolic. Antony would do the actual fighting. For 2 weeks the armies stared at each other across the plain. Skirmishes flickered along the edges. Engineers dug trenches. Scouts probed for weakness. Neither side wanted to attack first. The ground favoured defence, and the casualties from a frontal assault would be catastrophic. Cassius began to believe they could win by waiting. The triumvirs had supply problems. Their fleet had suffered losses trying to cross the Adriatic. If the assassins simply held their position, let autumn deepen into winter, starve the enemy out. Antony refused to cooperate with this strategy. On October 3rd, 42 BC, Antony moved. Not against the main fortifications, that would have been suicide, but through the marshes to the south, driving a hidden road through the reeds toward Cassius's flank. His engineers worked in silence, laying logs over mud, building a causeway that enemy scouts somehow failed to detect until it was nearly complete. When Cassius finally saw what was happening, he responded with counter-fortifications, a wall cutting across the marshland to block Antony's approach. It worked, for a moment. The wall held. Then Antony attacked anyway. The sound reached the main camp first. Bronze on bronze, the rhythm of 10,000 men trying to kill each other in a space too small for formation fighting. Cassius's defensive wall was breached within an hour. His soldiers were pushed back step by bloody step, through mud that sucked at ankles and stank of rotting vegetation. The air filled with the wet crunch of bodies falling and the screams of men drowning in marsh water. Cassius retreated to a small hill to survey the disaster. From his vantage point, the southern sector was clearly lost. Antony's men were pouring through the breach, his own legions streaming backward in disorder. Dust clouds obscured the northern sector where Brutus commanded, making it impossible to see what was happening there. He sent a scout to learn Brutus's situation. The scout rode off and vanished into the chaos. Historians still debate whether what happened next was a failure of communication, a failure of courage, or simply the accumulated weight of 2 years of stress finally breaking a man who had borne more than most could imagine. What Cassius saw from his hilltop was cavalry approaching through the dust. He couldn't see their standards. He couldn't identify their allegiance. All he knew was that his wing had collapsed. The enemy was advancing and unknown horsemen were riding toward him at speed. He assumed the worst. Those were Antony's cavalry. Brutus had been defeated. The battle was lost. Everything, the conspiracy, the war, the republic, was finished. Cassius turned to his freedman Pindorus and gave a single order. The sword was quick. Cassius died looking at the dust clouds he had misread. The horsemen he had misidentified. The battle he had actually been winning. Because those cavalry weren't Antony's men. They were Brutus's messengers, riding to tell Cassius that the northern sector had achieved complete victory. Brutus had smashed Octavian's wing. His legions had overrun the enemy camp, captured the baggage, sent the triumvir's soldiers running in panic. Octavian himself had barely escaped, hidden in a marsh, some accounts say, or carried away by bodyguards moments before capture. The first day of Philippi was a draw. One wing destroyed for each side, one commander dead for each army. The battle that would decide the fate of the Roman Republic had ended in stalemate. But only one side had lost its architect. Cassius was the brain of the conspiracy. Cassius was the strategist, the planner, the man who had seen clearly when Brutus could only see principles. Without him, the assassin army was a body without a head. And Brutus, noble, philosophical, principled Brutus, was now alone. 20 days passed between the battles. 20 days of waiting, of watching, of slow psychological disintegration. Brutus buried Cassius with full honours, but quietly. Too much ceremony would remind the army that their best general was dead, and morale was already fragile. He gave speeches, he distributed donatives, he did everything a commander was supposed to do when trying to hold an army together by force of will. It wasn't enough. The problem was simple. Brutus's army was starving. Their supply lines ran east, through Thrace and across the sea to Asia Minor. The Triumvir's fleet had recovered from its earlier losses and was now intercepting grain shipments with devastating efficiency. Every day that passed, the Assassin army grew weaker. Every day that passed, the Triumvirs grew stronger. Their western supply routes remained intact, and Antony was bringing up reinforcements. Brutus's officers urged him to wait. The defensive position was still strong. Antony might grow impatient and attack, giving them the advantage. Winter was approaching. Perhaps the enemy would withdraw to more comfortable quarters. Brutus listened to this advice. He knew it was sound. He had studied enough military history to understand that patience was usually the wiser strategy. He attacked anyway. Historians still debate whether this was strategic desperation. The supply situation genuinely was critical, or psychological collapse. What the sources agree on is that something had changed in Brutus during those 20 days. He had become fatalistic, resigned. He spoke of omens, of dreams, of a visitation in his tent. "I will see you at Philippi," a ghost had told him, or so he claimed. The ghost wore Caesar's face. On October 23rd, Brutus ordered a general assault. His legions marched down from their fortified position, abandoning the defensive advantage that had kept them alive for 3 weeks. They formed up on the plain, shields locked, pylon ready, facing an enemy that couldn't quite believe its luck. Antony had been trying to provoke exactly this outcome since the first battle. He had sent insults, challenges, mock retreats designed to draw Brutus out. None of it had worked, and now, without any apparent reason, Brutus was giving him exactly what he wanted. The collision was apocalyptic. 100,000 men slammed into each other on a dusty plain with no quarter expected and none given. The front lines compressed into a grinding wall of flesh and bronze, men pushing against men, swords stabbing blindly, bodies falling and being trampled into mud by the soldiers behind them. The air turned thick with dust and blood mist, reducing visibility to arm's length, transforming the battle into 1,000 separate knife fights conducted simultaneously. Brutus rode behind his lines, shouting encouragement, directing reserves to weakening sectors, playing the role of commander even as his army bled out beneath him. He still believed, or pretended to believe, that virtue could prevail over circumstance. It couldn't. The Triumvir legions were fresher, better fed, better supplied. They had momentum on their side and something more powerful, the promise of rich plunder if they won, death if they lost. Octavian had recovered from his illness enough to take the field, adding his presence to Antony's charisma. The Assassin army was fighting for an abstraction. The Triumvir army was fighting to survive. The break came in the late afternoon. A section of Brutus's line buckled. Not dramatically, just a gradual backward drift that became a retreat that became a rout. Men threw away their shields to run faster. Officers who tried to restore order were knocked down and trampled. The panic spread like plague, first to adjacent units, then to entire legions. Brutus rode into the chaos, trying to rally what could not be rallied. His guards pulled him back, physically restraining him from charging into the enemy alone. They retreated to a nearby hill as darkness fell, gathering perhaps 4 legions worth of survivors around them, less than a quarter of the army he had led that morning. The night was cold. Brutus sat among his men, speaking quietly to those closest to him. He quoted Greek philosophy, Euripides probably, or perhaps Plato. He spoke of virtue being its own reward, of having nothing to regret, of death being preferable to dishonour. Then he asked his closest friends one by one to help him die. They refused. All of them refused. They begged him to escape, to regroup, to continue the fight from Asia or Africa, or anywhere that wasn't this blood-soaked hill. Strato didn't refuse. Strato was a Greek, a tutor, a friend who understood that some requests cannot be denied. He held the sword while Brutus ran upon it, driving steel through his own chest in a single motion. The last words recorded were these: "Virtue, I thought you were real, but you were only a word." The man who had killed Caesar to save the Republic died, believing that the very concept of virtue was an illusion. The heads arrived in Rome before the news did. Packages wrapped in salt-crusted cloth, borne by fast riders on the post roads, delivered directly to the Triumvir's representatives in the Forum. The heads of Brutus and Cassius, or what remained of them after weeks of transport in Mediterranean heat, were unpacked and displayed as proof that the conspiracy had been destroyed. Octavian had ordered Brutus's body treated with respect. Antony countermanded the order. By the time the matter was settled, soldiers had already stripped the corpse and kicked it around the battlefield. What was eventually sent back to Rome was partial and decomposed. The display was a spectacle. Citizens gathered to stare at the ruined features of men who had once sat in the Senate, who had commanded armies, who had believed themselves the saviours of Roman liberty. Children pointed. Veterans spat. Someone threw a rotten fig. But the heads were just the beginning. The proscription lists had never been rescinded. Every senator who had lifted a blade against Caesar remained legally condemned, their property confiscate, their persons subject to execution on sight. The triumvirs had promised rewards, not just for the ringleaders but for anyone connected to the conspiracy. Gold for heads, land for heads, freedom for slaves who betrayed their masters. The hunting season was open. Lucius Tillius Cimber had been the signal giver on the Ides of March. The man who approached Caesar with a fake petition, grabbed his toga, pulled it down to expose his neck for the first blow. He fled to the eastern Mediterranean after the assassination and spent 2 years moving between cities, seeking refuge, finding none. He died somewhere in Asia Minor. The sources do not record how. Perhaps executed, perhaps killed by bounty hunters, perhaps simply worn down by exile until his body failed. His head was worth gold. Someone collected. Gaius Servilius Casca had struck the first actual blow, a clumsy slash that grazed Caesar's shoulder, the wound that opened everything. He died at Philippi, either in battle or by his own hand afterward. Accounts differ. His brother, Publius Casca, died the same way. Two brothers who had thought they were making history, reduced to footnotes in somebody else's victory. Minucius Basileus had been one of the more enthusiastic conspirators, eager for violence, perhaps too eager. He survived the immediate aftermath only to be murdered by his own slaves in 43 BC, beaten to death in his own home. The slaves were subsequently executed, but slowly, over days, as examples. Historians still debate whether the slaves acted for political reasons or personal grievance. What the sources agree on is the poetic symmetry. A man who had helped butcher Caesar was butchered in turn, by people he had treated as property. Cicero's death was the most famous, though he had not been an assassin himself. He had merely celebrated the assassination, defended the assassins, used his legendary oratory to attack Antony in a series of speeches so devastating they made reconciliation impossible. For this crime of words he was hunted down on a country road, his head and hands severed and sent to Rome. Fulvia received them personally. Antony's wife, a woman of a legendary vengeance, took Cicero's head and placed it on her dining table. Then she pulled a hairpin from her hair, gold, sharp, elegant, and drove it through the tongue that had spoken against her husband. Again, and again, and again. When she was finished, the tongue was shredded. The head was mounted on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum, displayed beside the hands that had written the Philippics. The greatest voice in Roman history, silenced by a hairpin and mounted like a hunting trophy. The message was unmistakable. Eloquence was no protection. Principles were no protection. Even being right, if Cicero had been right, was no protection. Only power protected, and power belonged to the triumvirs. The remaining conspirators died in a cascade of small tragedies. Some fell in battle, some took their own lives, some were captured and executed, their deaths recorded in single lines by historians who had larger matters to attend to. A few simply vanished, dead, presumably, but when and where and how remained mysteries that would never be solved. Of the 60 men who had entered the conspiracy against Caesar, not one survived the decade, not one died peacefully in his bed, not one lived to see his grandchildren or enjoy the retirement he had imagined when he raised his blade. They had wanted to be heroes. They had wanted their names inscribed alongside the great tyrannicides of history. Instead, their names became synonyms for failure, and the men who killed them, the avengers who had pursued them across the Mediterranean, who had displayed their heads like hunting trophies, who had driven hairpins through dead tongues. They were about to turn on each other. History remembers Brutus and Cassius because history needs protagonists. But there were others, dozens of others, senators who had joined the conspiracy with varying degrees of enthusiasm, struck blows of varying force, fled with varying success. Their names appear in ancient sources as lists, as footnotes, as brief mentions that give no sense of who these men were or how they died. They were the supporting cast in a drama that consumed their lives completely. Consider Gaius Trebonius, already discussed, who died screaming in Smyrna. Consider Decimus Brutus, already discussed, who died in a Gallic forest. But there were more, so many more. Lucius Minucius Basileus has already been mentioned, beaten to death by slaves, but the manner of his death deserves closer examination because it reveals something about the condition of the conspirators in those years of waiting. Basileus was not a moderate man. He was cruel to his household, perhaps crueler than usual as the stress of his situation mounted. His slaves did not kill him for political reasons. They killed him because they hated him, because the conspiracy had turned him into something unbearable, because the pressure of knowing death was coming had made him take out his fear on those who could not fight back. The violence we inflict often reflects the violence we expect to receive. Pontius Aquila had been a tribune of the people, a man who once publicly refused to stand when Caesar's chariot passed in triumph, a small act of defiance that Caesar never forgot. He joined the conspiracy eagerly, perhaps hoping to transform that small defiance into something larger. He died at the Battle of Mutina in 43 BC, fighting against Antony, believing until the end that the Republic could still be saved. His death was clean, at least. A soldier's death. More than most of them received. Historians still debate the total number of conspirators who died by violence versus those who died in exile. From illness, from the slower forms of destruction that awaited men who had lost everything. What the sources agree on is that none of them prospered. None of them escaped the consequences of the Ides of March. The conspiracy was a trap that closed slowly over years, killing some quickly, some slowly, but killing everyone eventually. Quintus Ligarius had been one of the lesser conspirators, a man whose inclusion in the plot was almost accidental. He had personal grievances against Caesar, and Brutus had recruited him more from friendship than from any assessment of his usefulness. He died at Philippi, unremarkably one corpse among thousands. Lucius Cornelius Cinna, not the poet who was torn apart by mistake, but the actual conspirator who shared the name, apparently survived the initial purges. He may have fled to an eastern province. The sources lose track of him. Perhaps he died in some forgotten skirmish. Perhaps he lived for years in exile, growing old in a provincial town, waiting for hunters who never came. His story simply ends, mid-sentence, with no resolution. This was the fate of most of them. Not grand tragedy, but quiet erasure. The historical record notes their participation in the conspiracy and then nothing. They step onto history's stage, raise their daggers and step off again into darkness. Some, like Cassius Parmensis, lived longer than the others. Parmensis was a poet as well as a conspirator, a man of culture who had believed the Republic worth killing for. He survived Philippi, fled to Athens, then to Asia, then to Egypt, always staying one step ahead of the hunters. He wrote poetry in exile, verses that no longer survive, words that were probably beautiful and are now lost forever. Octavian caught him eventually. After Actium, after Antony's defeat, after the last pockets of resistance had been mopped up, Parmensis was found and executed. He was the last of the conspirators to die, more than a decade after the Ides of March. One imagines him receiving the news of each comrade's death over those years. Trebonius, tortured to death. Decimus, betrayed in Gaul. Cassius, suicide by misunderstanding. Brutus, suicide by despair. One by one, the names crossed off, until only his remained. The last assassin, the final name. When the soldiers came for him, he must have known it was almost a relief. A decade of running, of hiding, of watching everyone he had trusted die badly. And now, finally, it would be over. The records do not preserve his last words. Perhaps he had none worth recording. Perhaps by then he understood that words had never mattered, that the speeches about liberty and tyranny had been decorations hung on simpler truths about power and its uses. He had raised a blade against Caesar. Now he was the last to pay the price. The triumvirate was never meant to last. 3 men had divided the Roman world because they needed each other. Antony for his military reputation, Octavian for Caesar's name, Lepidus for his legions and his harmlessness. They had united against a common enemy, and that enemy was now dead. Every conspirator executed, every head mounted in the Forum, had been another brick removed from the foundation of their alliance. With the assassins gone, the question became inevitable. Who would rule Rome? Lepidus answered first by being removed from the game entirely. His position had always been the weakest, his personality the least commanding. In 36 BC, Octavian manoeuvred him into a confrontation in Sicily, stripped him of his armies through a combination of bribery and intimidation, and exiled him to a small Italian town where he would spend the next 2 decades as a powerless nonentity. Not killed. Octavian was more subtle than that, but neutralized so completely that he might as well have been dead. That left Antony and Octavian, the general and the politician, the lover and the calculator. Their conflict was inevitable, but it took time to develop. For years they maintained the pretense of alliance, dividing territories, exchanging family members as hostages and spouses, communicating through diplomatic letters that grew progressively colder. Antony took the east, the wealthy provinces of Asia, Syria, Egypt. Octavian took the west, Italy, Gaul, Spain, the heartland of Roman power. The breaking point was a woman. Cleopatra VII of Egypt was not merely Antony's lover. She was a strategic asset, a source of grain and gold and naval power. Antony needed her resources, but he also genuinely loved her, or something that resembled love closely enough to alter his judgment. He divorced Octavian's sister Octavia to be with Cleopatra. He gave Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. He staged ceremonies in Alexandria that looked, to Roman eyes, like the establishment of a rival monarchy in the East. Octavian used every bit of it. Historians still debate whether Antony was genuinely planning to establish an Eastern Empire with Cleopatra, or whether Octavian's propaganda simply made it appear that way. What the sources agree on is that the propaganda was devastatingly effective. Romans who had never cared about politics suddenly cared deeply when they were told that Antony had become a puppet of an Egyptian queen, that he planned to move the capital to Alexandria, that Roman soldiers were dying to make Cleopatra's children kings. War came in 31 BC. The Battle of Actium was not much of a battle. Antony's fleet was trapped in a harbour, his army was deserting, his position was hopeless before the fighting even started. Cleopatra's ships broke through the blockade and fled south. Antony, seeing his lover escape, abandoned his fleet and followed her. They died together in Alexandria the following year. The details vary. Antony possibly falling on his sword after hearing a false report of Cleopatra's death. Cleopatra possibly dying from the bite of an asp she had concealed in a basket of figs. What matters is that they died, and that their deaths cleared the last obstacle between Octavian and absolute power. The Avengers had consumed each other. The men who had united to destroy Caesar's killers had destroyed each other instead. Octavian stood alone. He would rename himself Augustus. He would transform the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. He would rule for more than 40 years, dying peacefully in his bed at the age of 75, the only major player in this entire drama to escape violent death. And here is the bitter irony that the assassins never lived to witness. Everything they had feared came true. Caesar had been killed for being a dictator, a king in all but name, a man who concentrated too much power in his own hands. And within 20 years of his death, Rome was ruled by an emperor, a title Octavian carefully avoided, but a reality he embodied completely. The conspirators had murdered to prevent monarchy. Their murder had created a monarchy. They had killed to save the Republic. Their killing had destroyed the Republic. Everything they believed in died with them, not despite their actions, but because of them. The chaos they unleashed, the civil wars they triggered, the power vacuums they created, all of it led inexorably to the very outcome they had sacrificed everything to prevent. Brutus and Cassius thought they were heroes. They were the architects of their own nightmare. In the end, 60 men raised their blades against Gaius Julius Caesar. They gathered in the portico of Pompey's theatre on the Ides of March, 44 BC, wearing their best togas, hiding their daggers beneath the wool. They had convinced themselves they were acting in the tradition of Rome's greatest heroes, the tyrannicides, the saviours, the men who had expelled kings and preserved liberty through violence. Every single one of them died for that conviction. Trebonius died screaming in Smyrna, tortured for days until his voice gave out and his body followed. Decimus Brutus died in a Gallic forest. Betrayed by a barbarian chieftain for bounty money, his body left for wolves. Cassius died on a hilltop at Philippi, killing himself over a misunderstanding, believing the battle lost when it was actually won. Brutus died 20 days later, running on a sword held by his friend, his last words declaring virtue itself to be an illusion. The minor conspirators died in scattered obscurity, in battles, in exiles, in murders that the historical record barely troubled to preserve. Cassius Parmensis survived the longest, more than a decade of running, before Octavian's soldiers finally caught him and ended the conspiracy's last living member. Not one died peacefully, not one escaped the consequences of the Ides of March. Historians still debate whether the assassination was justified, whether Caesar would have destroyed the Republic had he lived, whether his killers acted from principle or ambition, whether different choices might have led to different outcomes. These debates will never be resolved. The sources contradict each other. The evidence permits multiple interpretations. We will never know what was in their hearts. But we know what happened. We know the consequences. We know that the Republic they claimed to be saving did not survive their rescue attempt. The Roman Republic had endured for nearly 5 centuries before Caesar's death. It had survived invasions, civil wars, dictatorships, every crisis that history could throw at it. It had bent but never broken, adapted but never surrendered its fundamental character. The Senate still met, the assemblies still voted, the magistrates still served their terms and stepped aside for their successors. Within 15 years of the Ides of March, all of that was gone. Augustus, the name Octavian took after defeating Antony, maintained republican forms while draining republican substance. The Senate still met, but it met to ratify decisions already made. The assemblies still voted, but they voted for candidates approved by the emperor. The magistrates still served their terms, but their power was borrowed from a throne that would never be called a throne. The assassins had feared that Caesar would make himself king. They had killed him to prevent it. And by killing him, they had created something worse than a king. An emperor whose power was absolute, whose successors would include Caligula and Nero, whose system would endure for centuries while the republic they loved became a memory and then a myth. This is the tragedy that no one involved could see clearly. The cure was worse than the disease. If Caesar had lived, perhaps the republic would still have died, but slowly, gradually, with compromises and accommodations that might have preserved something worth preserving. Instead, the conspirators forced a confrontation that the Republic could not survive. They made civil war inevitable. They made the choice between chaos and autocracy, and Rome, exhausted, traumatized, desperate for stability, chose autocracy. The assassins did not save the Republic. They performed its execution. Consider what they purchased with their 23 wounds, 14 years of civil war, hundreds of thousands dead in battles at Mutina, Philippi, Actium, and a dozen smaller engagements. Proscriptions that murdered Rome's best citizens for political convenience. Provinces devastated, treasuries emptied, institutions hollowed out until they collapsed. And at the end of it all, an emperor. Not Caesar. Caesar might have been mortal, might have died and been succeeded by something less authoritarian. But Augustus was young when he took power, healthy despite his chronic illnesses, patient in ways that Caesar never was. He lived long enough to institutionalize his power, to train successors, to make the monarchy feel permanent and inevitable. The Republic was dead. The men who killed to save it were dead. And the system that replaced both would shape Western civilization for 2,000 years. Gaius Cassius Longinus died at 53 by his own hand on a dusty hillside in Greece. Marcus Junius Brutus died at 43 by his own hand under a cold October sky. Gaius Trebonius died at approximately 50, screaming. Decimus Junius Brutus died at approximately 40, in a forest for gold. The others died younger or older, in battle or in exile, quickly or slowly. Their names are remembered because they are attached to a moment, that frozen instant when daggers rose and fell in Pompey's theatre. But their lives after that moment have been largely forgotten. They became ghosts long before they became corpses. Rome endured, the system endured, the power they tried to check grew into something monstrous and magnificent. an empire that would span continents and centuries. The men did not endure, the republic they murdered for did not endure, and the history that was written afterward. It was written by the victors, by Augustus and his heirs, by senators who had learned to kneel, by poets who praised the new order, because praising the new order was how you survived. They built statues to Augustus. They did not build statues to the liberators. They told stories of the golden age that Augustus had inaugurated. They did not tell stories of the republic that his rise had destroyed. The assassins had wanted to be heroes. History made them into warnings. 60 men, 23 wounds, one moment that changed everything, and not a single death that was worth the price.